As part of my action plan, I focused on effective questioning techniques and establishing discussions within the classroom. Throughout my final placement, I intended to use effective questioning techniques to encourage critical thinking amongst my students. There were a number of techniques that I attempted to use to enhance attention, engagement, and communication of ideas. Although there are many reasons, the most important reason why I chose to study how to effectively ask and respond to questions is to learn how to actively involve students in acquiring, exploring, and analysing information. There are many benefits to questioning students and encouraging discussions in the classroom, especially as we progress towards student-centred learning versus teacher-centred lecture-style teaching. Questioning encourages recalling of information, deepens the learning process and understanding, promotes imagination and problem-solving skills, as well as enhances engagement in the classroom. Research shows that primary school teachers and students usually ask one question every 2 minutes. However, this frequency of questioning is much lower in secondary schools. Presently, one of the main aims of secondary education is the development of critical and creative thinking. These skills can be achieved through eliciting students' deep learning through questioning. Apart from allowing students to recall information relating to their subject material, questioning prepares students to analyse and make informed, intelligent decisions in their day-to-day lives. Despite these positive associations, there is inconsistent implementation of questioning techniques across discipline and grade levels, conceivably resulting in a negative effect on student achievement. It is imperative that the classroom environment established is ideal for effective questioning. For both teacher and student questioning to be effective, the environment must be a supportive learning environment. Frisby and Martin found that positive rapport between both the teacher and fellow students made students feel comfortable and willing to participate in asking and answering questions. Safe learning environments welcome questions from all students and non-judgmental, do not ridicule incorrect answers, as everyone has a right to learn and make mistakes. I found that towards the end of my 6-week placement, I had built very strong relationships with the students in my classes. I was able to cater questions based on interest and academic capabilities in a way that students felt were customised to their learning. Having discussions and finding volunteers to answer became easier as students felt more comfortable in my presence. My mentor commented that he noticed some students coming out of their shells and having the confidence to ask and answer questions. I believe that it is imperative for students to feel safe and comfortable in their learning environment. Students who were insecure initially were not willing participants in discussions. I attempted to work with these students one-on-one until they became comfortable in my teaching style. Research has found that teacher misbehaviours such as sarcasm and negative attitude can affect the ability for a democratic classroom, whereby students and teachers can discuss and debate conflicting ideas in a way to find solutions to problems that satisfy the teacher, individual student, and the classroom as a whole. There are many benefits for students and teachers to participate in discussions and asking and answering questions. Participation adds interest. It's hard to maintain students' focus and attention when all they hear is the teacher talking. It helps to hear another voice as well as an answer or another point of view. Students can learn from each other with the use of class and small group discussions and the effective use of questioning techniques. Participation engages students. A good question can pique students' interest, make them wonder why, get them to think, and motivate them to make connections with the content. This benefit is magnified when teachers play a bit with the question, when they repeat it, write it on the board, and don't call on the first hand they see. Initially, I struggled with this. I would ask a question and take the first hand that shot up in the air. After a couple of lessons, I found that a couple of the confident, high-achieving students were monopolising the discussions. This allowed the quiet, less confident students to hide in their silence. Over time, I began to praise the efforts of the students willing to participate in discussions, but called on others to contribute. This sometimes meant sitting in silence for 15 to 30 seconds. I found this difficult at the start and would panic, giving the students the answers to my questions. After some time, I stayed silent, giving students time to formulate responses. They realized that someone would have to answer the question, otherwise I would stay silent. I tried to distribute questions so that all the students had a chance of participating in discussions. This involved being aware of who has answered questions and who has not. I called on volunteers and non-volunteers. This was an important strategy of mine to ensure that all of the students felt like they were valuable members of the class. If someone had answered too many questions, I would try and get those who hadn't more involved. Participation provides the teacher feedback. When students answer or try to explain, teachers can see the extent of their understanding. They can correct or help the students correct what the students haven't understood. When a student answered a question incorrectly, I would provide feedback and give some probing questions to try and get the student to understand where they went wrong. If they could not understand it, I would ask another student to explain how to answer the question correctly. I would follow up the correct explanation with a brief summary or repetition of the correct response. Asking and answering questions also provides feedback for the student. They can begin to understand what concepts covered are important. At the beginning of each lesson, I attempted to review what was covered in the previous class. This was done with the use of questions, quizzes, or worksheets that were corrected as a group. Over time, the students in my class began to realize that they would most likely be called upon to answer a question. This encouraged students to come to class prepared to work, having reflected on the previous class. I used questioning as a way of controlling what was happening in class. If I noticed that students were becoming distracted, talking, or off task, I would call upon those students to answer some questions. Participation encourages dialogue among and between students. Students can be asked to comment on what other students have said. I would ask an open-ended question in science class and invite students to discuss possible answers within pairs or small groups before the whole class discussed it. Participation in class discussion can be used to develop important speaking skills. In most professional contexts, people need to be able to speak up in a group. They may need to offer information, ask questions, or argue for a different solution. People don't learn to speak up in a group by reading about how to do it. It's one of those skills best developed with practice. I found that the more students contributed to group discussions, the more praise they received and the more confident they became to contributing to future discussions. Participation gives students the opportunity to practice using the language of the discipline. Particularly in science discussions, students were encouraged to use scientific language in their answers. While this was a challenge to some students, some became more confident using this new vocabulary with increased exposure to the language. The most important aspect of improving my questioning technique in the classroom was to plan time to question students and allow students to ask questions. Time was allocated at the beginning of each class to reflect and review concepts covered during the previous class. When new ideas were introduced, I allocated time for small group and class discussions to clarify any misconceptions. I used cognitive probes, peppering questions to ensure students are paying attention and understanding the content covered. This was beneficial when revising the topics of solids, liquids, gases, and mixtures prior to a Year 7 science test. I was able to get an idea of the level of understanding of the topic and what concepts needed to be revisited for further clarification. Whilst I aimed to rehearse my questions in the presence of my mentor, this was not often possible due to the hectic demand of his workload. However, I ensured that I received feedback after each lesson to allow me to reflect and alter my teaching style. Sometimes I had to reword my questions to make them easier for students to understand. For example, when discussing adaptations of animals in science, I asked, "What does adaptation mean?" No one raised their hand. When I asked who has heard of the word adapt, everyone raised their hand. Some students were even able to provide me with a good definition of the word adaptation with a little probing. I ensured that I only asked one question at a time. I knew that if I peppered too many questions at one time, students would become anxious and confused about what I expected them to know. I also practiced asking a question, giving some time for students to formulate a response, then asked a particular student to give me a response. This ensured that students, especially those that can sometimes become anxious when put on the spot, were given some warning that they would be expected to come up with an answer. It also ensured that all students thought about the question before I revealed who would be answering it. I attempted to gear questions to the ability levels of students. Initially, this was extremely difficult as I did not know the capabilities of the student. This required effective communication with my mentor teachers to know which students will be capable of answering difficult questions and which students required easier questions. This was especially important in the mathematics classroom, where math anxiety is a common issue amongst students. I had to ensure that I did not continually ask questions that were too difficult for a student, as they may have lost confidence and become withdrawn from participating in future class discussions. On the other hand, if the questions were too easy and not challenging, the high achievers could become disengaged and lose focus. As a mathematics and science teacher, I am aware of the challenges in engaging and motivating students. Many students find maths irrelevant to their day-to-day lives. I attempted to find or create questions that were relevant to my students and attempted to personalize them. For example, when teaching about mean, median, and mode in mathematics, I collected some information from my students, including number of siblings, height, jump length, and throwing distance of a vortex. We then discussed the different averages of the class results. I allowed students time to brainstorm ideas with their fellow students. This helps with higher level thinking and allows students to learn from their peers. For example, when learning about the angle sum of a polygon, I gave a difficult question to the class and asked them to find ways of solving it within small groups. I then asked 3 groups to explain to the rest of the class how they had calculated the angle sum of the complex shape. This way, students were critically evaluating their knowledge and applying it to a difficult problem. It encouraged students to learn from their peers rather than constantly relying on the teacher's explanation. Following questioning, I aimed to provide feedback to students. It was important that I was honest and providing constructive feedback. There is little or no benefit to students who are continually being praised for incorrect responses. Whilst praising effort is effective, as students can control their level of participation in the class, praising performance can be futile. Praise on high-achieving students will lose its effect if overused. Praising an incorrect answer will not encourage the student to attempt to reach a correct solution in the future. It was important to be consistent with feedback, correcting wrong responses, or probing the student to reach a correct answer, and praising correct answers. At the beginning of my placement, I discussed my goals of practicing effective questioning techniques and encouraging discussions with my mentors to ensure they both understood what I would like to achieve. I sought feedback, listened to their advice, and reflected on my teaching. I made changes that my mentors suggested to enhance engagement and participation in group discussions. In conclusion, I believe that this action plan that focused on effective questioning techniques and improved classroom discussions will help prepare me for the future, where I hope to encourage my students to critically evaluate things around them. The ability to ask and respond to questions is a valuable skill required for all teachers as we move away from a teacher-centered classroom towards the critical thinking, student-centered environment.